Good evening and welcome to Philly Live. I'm Ashok, your global connection. Tonight, when corporations rule the world. What happens when corporations rule the world? In his international bestseller, When Corporations Rule the World, Dr. Koren shows how the convergence of ideological, political, and technological forces is leading an ever greater concentration of economic and political power in a handful of corporations and financial institutions, and separating their interests from the interests of human beings, and dominating our economic worlds with the bottom line of financial profits. In his thought-provoking book, David exposes the harmful effects of economic globalization and presents a strategy for correcting this. Dr. Koren is founder and president of the People-Centered Development Forum, a global alliance dedicated to the creation of just, inclusive, and sustainable societies. He earned MAB and PhD degrees from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. David, welcome to Philly Live.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Among your many contributions, you're also involved in Yes Magazine publication, aren't you?
Yes, I'm the board chair of the Positive Futures Network, which is the publisher of Yes.
And what is the point of this journal, the Yes Journal?
Well, in these troubled times, it's about stories of people who are making a difference. And our basic message is that things can be different. We can create a world that works for all, but it requires the engagement of every person, and here are ways to be engaged, and here are stories of people who are making a difference.
Well, and that seems to be a wonderful follow-through to your important book, When Corporations Rule the World. Help our viewers understand, how did you come to write that? Give us a sense of your journey.
Well, it's very interesting. I grew up in a small town, very conservative family and small business. In college, I was very active in the Young Republicans, concerned about communist revolutions around the world, threatening our American way of life. So in my senior year, I decided to take a little short course on modern revolutions to kind of try to understand what's going on, what can we do about it. And I learned about the connection between poverty and people's rebellion against a system that's not working for them. So I thought, well, you know, instead of going back to run the family business, what I'm going to do is devote my life to bringing American business genius to the rest of the world, in a sense bringing capitalism to the rest of the world so that everyone can be rich and happy like us. And so I spent 30 years setting up business schools in low-income countries, working on problems of rural development, a whole range of issues. We gradually began to realize that while places where I was living in Africa, Asia, Latin America, getting more of the modern accoutrements of development and airports and air-conditioned shopping malls and so forth. But for most people, life was actually getting harder and harder, and these rich cultures were being trashed, and more evidence of environmental destruction. And I started asking, well, what's going on here? And I thought, well, obviously development is a success. There's just something wrong in these places where I happen to be. But then I started looking at the statistics and realized, no, it's very general. And the biggest shock was when I realized that even here in the United States and in Europe, we were seeing more and more people excluded by the economic system, more environmental damage, and a breakdown of families and basic social structures. And set about to try to sort out why, and came to realize that it had a lot to do with the economic policies that our country is promoting, the rise of corporate power, and realized that my job was really to come back home to the United States, work on education here, and that led me to write this book, which actually drew back on my business school experience and what I'd learned about how corporations are organized and how they function.
Well, that's a wonderful journey, and it looks as if it really prepared you to be able to write this important book. It had quite an impact on so many people. What is your sense of the aftermath of this book? I mean, what next?
Well, there's so many things that are influence what's happening. But of course, the book came out in 1995 originally, which was just at the moment that people were starting to raise questions about what's going on with all this corporate downsizing and the export of jobs, and does this have anything to do with these trade agreements and the free trade and NAFTA and so forth. and what happened, the timing of the book was perfect because it allowed people to, it kind of gave an explanation of what was happening. What are the connections? How does this work?
It struck at a wonderful time. It really helped articulate what was going on.
Well, I really learned timing is essential there.
That's right. And one of the things in terms of your exposure of the economic globalization is to see that there really is an alternative culture that's emerging, a global civic life.
Yes.
Could you talk about that? I mean, this
Well,
takes us into your contemporary work now. I know you're working on the end
yeah.
of empire, your current work. Let's talk about that.
Well, what's happening is people become more conscious of the forces that are behind environmental and social destruction, and there's a realization coming up that it's not just a matter of kind of fixing this system. It's a matter of taking a step to a whole new human civilization, and it means rethinking at the most fundamental levels how we organize society. Now, part of what I've come to, I mean, the issues I was working on then, which are still very real and more real by the day, is the extent to which our power is shifted away from our governments, presumably democratically elected governments, to these institutions that are driven by the forces of the global financial system,
Right.
and that are single-purpose organizations simply to make money for people who already have money.
And they're giants, aren't they? I mean, they dominate the wealth of the planet.
They are. If you take a list of the 100 largest economies in the world, somewhere 51, 52 of them are economies internal to corporations,
Right.
as judged by their sales. Right. And so you have giant corporations that command larger economies in terms of economic resources than most countries, but their purpose is not really to make sure that everyone has enough to eat and has a decent place to live. Right. It's purely money. Mm-hmm. Now, what we're seeing in the social movements is, I think, an amazing cultural, spiritual, political awakening all around the world. That since that time we've had the most visible manifestation, of course, of the people out in the streets. The experience like the demonstrations against the World Trade Organization in Seattle.
That's a sign of this new culture emerging, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And part of what's so extraordinary about it is that it is so international. I mean, it's sometimes mischaracterized as an anti-globalization movement. Now, if you think about globalization in terms of increased communication, cooperation among people, that's an inexorable force, and these movements, in a sense, are partly an expression of that. I mean, this is clearly the most...
So it's important to distinguish two kinds of globalization amongst many.
Yes.
I mean, the economic globalization, which can seem to be a kind of empire, tyrannical, colonializing force, and then the other face of globalization, which is this kind of cultural revolution you're talking about.
Exactly. The increased communication among people, connection between people, is inevitable, but it's a question of how will that be organized? Will it be organized by a dominator hierarchy run by a few people or one nation? Or will it be organized as a cooperative community of people who are engaged in working together to try to create a world that works for everyone?
See, this is really what I'm very interested in exploring with you. And in case you're just joining us at home, I'm Ashok, your Global Connection here on Philly Live. Tonight we're talking about When Corporations Rule the World, the title of a wonderful best-selling book by Dr. David Koren, who's with us, and we're exploring the question, please imagine with us, what it would be like if our culture were not ruled by corporate forces, but by human interests. We're trying to explore that, so please continue, David, on that. What is this alternative now to corporations?
Well, one thing we need to make clear here is, when we're speaking about the kind of corporation that I'm talking about, is specifically the legal institution that involves public trading of the shares. The shares are sold in public markets, and that enjoys limited liability. Now, what the nature of this institution is that it's the most perverse form of absentee ownership we've ever created, because it concentrates all the power and the rights in the hands of people who bear no liability, no responsibility for the consequences of how that power is used.
So that's specifically what you're talking about when you speak about...
That's specifically what I'm talking about.
Right.
It's an institution that is programmed to act like a psychopath, or in the biological sense, like a cancer.
Wow.
A cell that forgets that it's part of a larger whole and simply seeks its own unlimited growth without regard to the consequences.
Now, you think this is inherently pathological in some sense.
In terms of this institutional form, yes.
Right.
If we, I mean, my field in business is organization and,
Right.
understanding the dynamics of how an organization works. And you step back and you say, well, I wanted to create an organization that would be as destructive as possible. It would be hard to do better than this particular
David, what's
form.
interesting is that that kind of structure of that kind of organization reflects a kind of consciousness. And I think if you step back and look across the planet at our great spiritual traditions, they all seem to suggest that an egocentric, myopic mentality has been at the heart of human pathologies of all kinds. Do you see a link?
Absolutely.
Could you talk about that?
Well, this carries that forward, and again, in the extreme way. I mean, part of what's so perverse about it is there are a lot of very good people who work in these kinds of corporations. But when you're employed by the corporation, you are an employee, and the system demands that you leave your personal values at the door. And if you start trying to take into consideration, well, if we do this, it will be harmful to the lives of thousands of our loyal employees, or it will be harmful to the environment, or it's not being loyal to the community that has supported us over the years. If you start to bring that in, you're very likely to be quickly fired.
Right.
So it absolutely enforces this this myopic, egocentric point of view. And it's also interesting that if one looks at the questions of human maturity and how we grow up as individuals from infancy, hopefully to mature adulthood, it is a process of moving beyond that egocentric orientation that we're born with. We don't see any difference between ourselves and the rest of the world. We learn gradually to differentiate, and then we're negotiating our own needs, and then eventually we begin to realize, well, other people have needs, and then I'm part of a larger community, I'm part of a larger nation. Ultimately, if we keep growing, I'm part of a total world, or part of the whole of creation, and must act as a participant. But the problem is our institutions, like the corporation, tend, even in our individual growth, to kind of lock us into a more infantile
kind of arrested development.
Arrested development,
But
yes.
What you just described as a pattern of maturation of the human beings seemed to take us into a kind of global outlook and a global perspective. Is that the kind of global civil society you're talking about? People like that?
Very much so. I mean, obviously, when you get large street demonstrations involving millions of people, you've got quite a variety of people with different motives. But the core of that group and the core energy of the people that I know are acting, one, from a very deep sense of spiritual connection, but also a very deep sense of connection to people of all races, religions, languages, and so forth, the classes all around the world. And it's actually acting out of a deep pain, that a realization that it doesn't have to be this way. There's no reason for it to be this way, and it's kind of like wake up. We have there are very different ways to live.
So that in moving from the present situation, which is dominated by the corporations and corporate life in the way that you describe it, what do you see as going to help us move to this alternative culture that's a global civil society? Well,
I think we're there are a number of things that have happened in the world that are I think contributing to an awakening of consciousness. Three things that I think are absolutely distinct to our particular moment in time. One is we literally have the technological capacity to destroy ourselves through nuclear weapons or biological weapons. We also, all we have to do is simply stay on the same economic path that we are on in terms of the environmental destruction, the destruction of the life support system as it relates to human beings, and we're on a path to our own extinction. So it creates an absolute imperative to wake up and choose differently. Now, we also, within our lifetimes, we experienced the human venture into space, which then gave us the ability to look back on ourselves, look back on this living jewel of a planet in the dark void of space, and realize...
Many see that as a kind of shift in our consciousness, symbolic.
Absolutely. This is one world, one people, one destiny.
Right.
And that's an incredible shift in our perspective. Now, the third development, which is also, we've had international travel for a long time, but it's really been more or less within the last 50 years that we have, created the communication networks where, one, it's not at all unusual for many of us to travel all around the world, communicate with people of many different types. The internet coming into its own within the last 10 to 15 years, which allows instantaneous communication, virtually costless, among people all over the world, and is an incredible organizing tool for these social movements.
Right.
And then we also have international organizations like the United Nations, which create a forum in which people from all the world can come together to, it's not always as effective as it might be, and we can certainly make it better, but it's the first time we've even had an institutional vehicle where people could come together and say, is there a way to resolve our differences other than through war?
Mm-hmm. So these three powerful forces can all contribute to helping to bring this new consciousness and globalization in the good sense,
yes,
around the planet.
Now, I think there's another aspect to this that I think what we're seeing in part is an awakening of a new, I call it a cultural consciousness, which means a consciousness of culture. Now, part of our growing up experience, we each grow up within our own culture, and it is, it's just so natural. It's just that, we're not aware of it.
Right.
And so
we have a lens in the mind. We see the world that way from our culture.
exactly.
Right.
And we simply assume that is reality. That is
right.
the world,
Right.
because I don't know anything else. Now, again, part of this communication, and so many more people who've had, my experience has been somewhat extreme in terms of my international living, but so many people, including very young people now, are exposed to many different cultures, and you pretty quickly come to realize that there are a whole lot of different ways of seeing
Right.
reality, and some may be more positive than others, but they're all different windows into
Right.
a larger reality.
That's a major shift in consciousness to be able to handle multiple perspectives and worlds. And
Absolutely, and this is part of also this process of becoming more mature,
Right.
of being able to hold at one and the same time in the mind, understand my perspective, understand your
Right.
perspective, his perspective, and okay, there are elements to all of these, and also the material dimensions, the spiritual dimensions,
Right.
all in interplay.
Right, and so it looks as if that new mentality has a dialogue, that you can dance in dialogue, and you're also integral. Those seem to be two features of this kind of global maturity.
Absolutely.
But I noticed, I wonder how you think this through, because what you say about corporations in that narrow sense can also seem to apply to cultures that have this kind of narrow outlook, a monocentric lens. So it's in a way, cultures can behave like those corporations.
They can.
Right.
And there's a tendency in some of our religious cultures, particularly, to get that narrow view that that my God is the only God, or my God's
Right.
bigger than your God,
Which can lead to all sorts of violence. And,
absolutely.
as we see clearly on the planet right now.
And I think part of what I see emerging. The people involved in the kinds of progressive movements that I'm involved in. I think it's true that virtually all the leaders are acting from a deep kind of spiritual grounding. But it is a spiritual grounding that it's acting out of a sense of a universality of spirit.
Do you distinguish between religion and spirituality? That's a question that often comes up, because when you hear the word religion, people have some certain connotations with it. But now when you say people are acting out of the spiritual sense, is that different from a religious life, spirituality?
Well, it certainly is to me. So often the term religion is tied up with particular sets of dogma and ritual. And when I talk about people acting from a spiritual place, it's out of a sense that, at least as I experience it, that the whole of reality is a manifestation of a universal spirit, intelligence, consciousness.
Right.
Which means that all of life, all of reality is deeply connected.
Right. Well, let me just remind our viewers, I'm Ashok, you're watching Philly Live. You're a Global Connection, and we're here with Dr. David Koren and discussing his wonderful book and development since then, When Corporations Rule the World. So we're asking you to imagine with us what our world would be like if it's not dominated by corporate forces, but rather by human interests and human beings in this mature sense that we're talking about. So let's continue on that. So I'm trying to imagine, David, what the scenario would be as you look at the forces on the planet now between these two great forces. How do you see that playing out?
I don't make predictions. I think
people seem to have a kind of optimistic hope when they read your book, and I'm trying to tease that out of it.
Yeah, well, the optimist. This was quite a surprise to me when I first put the book out, and the number of people came to me and said, your book gave me a sense of hope. And
Right.
so it did. it certainly depressed me when I wrote it about
Right.
these forces. And what they came back and said is, well, yeah, there's a lot of bad things going on, but having read your book, I now understand how it works.
Right.
And once you understand how it works,
Good
you realize
point.
it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
And I think that's partly, and it comes into this issue of empire. I was very struck as I've been working on the research for my current book on End of Empire, that many historians equate civilization, the beginning of civilization, with the beginning of empire in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Essentially, the consolidation of territory under a unified military leadership.
Right. And it could lead to a kind of tyrannical, colonial, imperial type of...
Yeah, and it's a whole dominator system of organization. And then you begin to realize that throughout much of our history, a very major portion of humanity, particularly among intellectuals, have operated with a function with the belief that that's really the only way to organize human societies. That we are basically an unruly and violent species, and that the only way to establish order is through that kind of authoritarian structure.
Right. So I'm trying to imagine the alternative now with you, and I know in your recent essay here, Global Civil Society, The Path Ahead, you beautifully lay out step by step what would be a new kind of economy. How do we imagine the economy differently, you know, if human interests are dominating?
Well, see, partly the excuse me, the alternative of community structures, in many respects, needs to be grounded in this sense of spiritual connection or spiritual unity, because it's partly a matter of understanding the possibilities that exist within us to act in a cooperative, responsible mode with one another. Now, the interesting thing is, in terms of how this plays out in terms of economic alternatives, is the idea that rather than organizing economies under a kind of a single free-floating financial market and global monopolistic corporations, we actually can organize economies that look much more like the actual ideal of market economies that I was taught about in business school. Now, a real market economy is comprised of local businesses that are owned by real people who work in the enterprise, and they're creating the enterprise not to make a quick fortune and be able to destroy my competitors and so forth, but they're people who are saying, well, let's see, I need to create a livelihood for myself, so let me produce some goods and services, or start a restaurant or a shop or a farm or whatever, and exchange with my neighbors, and we'll meet each other's needs, and we'll create a prosperous community. And
sounds like a locally grounded.
Yeah, we call a local living economy.
Right.
And this set of ideas is coming together into a whole new national movement that, in fact, is centered right here in Philly with Judy Wicks and the White Dog Cafe.
She's been on our show,
founders.
by the way. She's been here in Philly Live with us, and we talked about that a bit when she was here.
So as you know, she's now co-chair of this national organization, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and chapters are sprouting up all around the country. Right,
and so in this new mentality, it seems as if this sense of connectivity and community is what's moving business life and political life as well. This has a sense of a new politics as well, doesn't it?
Very much so.
You often speak of democracy and a healthy democracy.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that for us?
Well, it's a very, it's a very defining issue right at this point in time. It's fascinating to me that, after the terrorist attack on September 11th, there was a great sense of desire for unity in the country. And I was particularly struck in conversations, the number of people are talking about the sense of desire for community, a sense of community, coming together.
Many flags were out, people were having a sense of patriotism.
And we had a choice at that moment. We could say, let's understand, why is it that there seem to be people in the world that don't like us? What are the forces behind this terrorist impulse? What do we need to do to create a world that works for all? Okay, these criminal elements in terms of the terrorists, we've got to deal with that. But how do you deal with that? That's got to be through international cooperation. These are hidden networks that run through every country, our own country and everybody else's. You can't bomb every country that as terrorists. This is police work. So we can say we need more international cooperation, we need to be creating a world that works for all, we need better police work, we need all of these things, or we can say, you know, what we got to do is impose order on the world by military force. We've got to find a few governments that we punish with bombing and invasion. And essentially one is the path of community, the other is the path of empire.
Right.
And what
So comment on the current administration then. I mean, how do you see that in terms of this scenario?
Yeah, it's very interesting because this administration has had a great impact on the thinking of global civil society. That
Yes.
It's forced us to look beyond just the element of corporate empire to recognize the reality and centrality of military empire. Now it's very interesting if you actually look at the documents defining our current defense policies and the writing of the people who are shaping those policies. They're acting absolutely explicitly and clearly from the vision of the world that, you know, it's a winner-take-all world, that you either rule or be ruled, you kill or be killed, you dominate or be dominated.
Right.
And it's the idea that we as America must dominate the rest of the world with unyielding military force.
Right. Now,
to impose a Pax Americana. This is a term that they actually use.
right, now we have 1 minute left, and I just want to pick up on your theme about the end of empire. Are you suggesting in your current work that there's going to be some kind of movement beyond that kind of dominator model?
Well, because we've come to the limits of the exploitation the planet will sustain, empire will fall. The question is how we come out of it.
Right.
And we have moved at a point that we have to make a decision, and this comes back, you know, it's a matter of choice. Do we choose to stay on the path of empire leading to our own self-destruction, or do we consciously choose the path of community, find the best that's within us, and begin rethinking our institutions and our culture in a way consonant with those values?
Well, our time is just about up. David, it's wonderful having you. We're going to have you back, and we're going to link to your website with the viewers to follow up on this. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Philly Live. And next week, we're going to continue, and look out for Deborah's show, Deborah D'Alessandro, the Lesbian and Gay Connection, coming up. For more information at tonight's show and all of our shows, log on to our website at wybe.org and we'll find a link to David's site. For Philly Live, I'm Ashok. Have a great evening. Good night.